So Ian, in this episode we are going to talk about, can landlords still increase rent after the new legislation comes into effect? Welcome to the All Things Property podcast with me, Simon Bacon of Preferential Properties. Every week, Ian Sadler and I will delve into all things property. We'll guide you through with friendly, no-nonsense advice. Ian, I think you've had something very recently about this.
Yeah, I had an email last night from a landlord just confirming a maintenance issue that he was given permission for, but he added an afterthought onto his email by saying that could we look at increasing all the rents now, because I'm not sure what's happening or what will happen, will I be able to when the new legislation comes in. And that's a theme really. Any aspect of this new Renters' Rights Act, it's a lack of knowledge of actually what's going to happen, what people can do and what they can't do.
Okay, so if you're a landlord asking that very question of when and how do I go about increasing the rents on my tenancies, this episode will be for you. So let's kick that off then. So the way that rents are increased now is through a Section 13 notice. And that is still going to be exactly the same under the new legislation, that the main mechanism will remain, that the Section 13 rent increase procedure will continue. So what does that actually mean now? How often can you serve a Section 13 notice under the new legislation?
The new legislation, if you have to wait for 12 months after the inception of a new tenancy, so 1st of January 26, you can't put the rent up again until 1st of January 27. If it's an existing tenancy, then you can put the rent up, but it has to be 12 months since the previous increase.
Yeah, exactly. And again, Section 13 notices can be quite challenging for landlords to complete. So if you have any questions regarding completing a Section 13 notice, then please do give us a call and we're happy to talk through the mechanisms, because if you do it wrong, the Section 13 notice can be challenged. So let's look at some different scenarios in terms of what do you do at the moment in terms of putting a rent up? Do you look at what kind of things do you consider when putting a rent up, or reviewing a rent, I should say?
Well, my approach to this might be slightly different to yours. I think you've got to get rents up to a market rent, or in your case a full market rent, I think maybe, but in mine I like to keep them more competitive from two angles. If you've got a tenant who's been in a property a long time and looked after the place, you have a vested interest in keeping that tenant happy. The best way to keep that tenant happy is to keep the rent reasonable, and to let them know when you increase the rent that it's still below market value, and they do appreciate that. But, and I try to explain this to landlords, is that, as I just said, that there is a point in keeping it fair and reasonable and slightly below market value.
Why?
Because you have a happy tenant, and a happy tenant is a happy tenancy. Okay. Reduces potential problems.
But where does the landlord sit then in terms of, so let's say you're saying to your landlord, you know, the market rent is £900, that's what I could get for it, but you've got a lovely tenant in there, and they're looking after the property, they're doing all the things a tenant should be doing, so I'm only going to charge them £850. Is that what the landlord wants? Is that the landlord maximising their rental income?
No, I don't think you can keep it. A maximum would be £50 below market value. I think £25. Or if you've got a property where they've been there for 5 years and the rent is visibly below market value, then there's two ways of doing it. You can put it straight up to a market value, which might be an increase of £150, £200, or you can stagger that increase, or work out the best route to get that that rental back up to a market value or close to it.
But is that just not you being a bad letting agent, not putting the rent up?
No, I'm aware. I review my rents probably more often than you do, to be honest.
No, you don't.
I do.
I don't think you do. How often do you review your rents?
I'm constantly finger on the pulse of rent increases. If I see
one...
but
you can only review it every 12 months, can't you?
Yes, I can. But if I get to a stage where, let's say the beginning of April, and I look at all the rents and I think that one could go up, that one could go up, that one should go up, then...
But what do you base that on? it's been 12 months.
No, don't be nasty. I base it on market value, suitability of tenant, how they're looking at. If I wanted, can I say this? If I wanted to focus a tenant's thoughts, then I'm more likely to say the market value for this rent is 1,100. You're paying 900. I'm going to put it up to 1,100, and you could do that under new legislation. You can do that. It's a market rent. If I want to keep the relationship, and you just as well as I do, think that a good relationship with a tenant and an agent, a three-way relationship, agent, landlord, tenant, is going to work. It's got communication, and if you can give them a little something to make them realise they're getting a good deal, even if it's £25 or £50 below market value, if it still works, that £50 a month that you're not getting could give you more benefits from a tenant looking after the property and staying there longer.
But that's £600 potentially a year that landlord is losing.
It is.
Given all the legislative changes and the requirements of landlords to potentially license their property or to make sure that everything is absolutely where it should be in terms of legal compliance, do you think that's the right approach? Is a landlord not going to go? How many landlords nationally are starting to say, it's not worth our while to do this because of, I've got this cost, my insurance has gone up.
I think a lot of landlords start from that perspective, that I'm going to get out of this business, it's not worth it anymore. But enough do, but not as many as you'd think. They start on the level of no knowledge, and it's the worst case scenario, it's not going to work for me. But 3 months, 6 months into the process, they've still got their properties. I've got a classic example I can't give you because he'd recognise who he is. But he every time something happens...
So you're going to tell us anyway?
No, I'm not. Every time something happens, he wants, I'm getting out of this, I'm selling it. But that was 12 months ago that started. It's still got all
but in
the
fairness
properties
to you,
now.
Ian, we all have landlords like that who, the moment that they have a big cost, their first thought is, I can't be doing this. They're not looking at it from a holistic approach, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, that's a part of our business, isn't it? Is educating people, tenants, landlords, you.
So let me perhaps put a question out there. Are you a landlord who checks your rent every 12 months? Are you a landlord who makes sure that your letting agent changes their rent, reviews the rent every 12 months or at least on a regular basis? Or are you a landlord who actually doesn't have a clue what the rent is on your property when it was last increased? Whatever you are, I think there are things in this episode that will resonate with you, and it's worth considering what we're talking about. So let's talk about maybe what if the tenant, give me an example of, have you put a rent up where the tenant has come back to you and gone, I want to leave because of that rent?
No.
It's
a process. You can start at A and end at B.
And do you think the Section 13 notice will still permit you to do that? What recourse does a tenant have? So if you're a tenant and you receive a Section 13 rent increase notice, what can you do about it?
They can appeal.
Who to?
The Rent Tribunal.
Okay. And what will the Rent Tribunal be doing? What will they base their judgment on?
Well, mainly the market rent. If it's considered to be at or slightly below a market rent, then they have no grounds for challenging it.
So therefore, when you do a rent increase notice, are you going to have to produce records to determine what is a market rent to support that?
If you needed to, if it was challenged, yeah, but that's pretty easy, isn't it?
Where do you think rents are at the moment? Up, down, staying where they are?
Definitely not increasing, staying where they are, slightly decreasing in certain cases, but I think the supply and demand effects in the rental market will keep rents where they are without any significant decreases, because there simply aren't enough properties around to supply the demand from tenants, so tenants have to pay the going rate.
So do you think landlords are familiar with rent levels?
I think most of them are.
Are
Most
they?
of mine are.
Do you get many landlords who challenge you as to
I wouldn't
why
say
you
challenge
put
is a
rent
fair
up?
word. They inquire gently. Do you think we could increase the rent here? At the end of the day, if a landlord's got investment properties and they're running smoothly, and there are no glaring differences between the rent they're getting and the market rent, they are less likely to challenge. They like a smooth process.
Hmm. What if a landlord decides that their rent is, imagine you're a landlord who hasn't put your rent up for a couple of years, and I think we've probably all got those landlords or know of let-only landlords that have done that. What could they be doing now?
Under the new legislation, which is what we're discussing, they could serve the Section 13 notice and increase the rent, and it's a straightforward process. If they're paying 900, the market rent is 1100. A landlord could ask for the rent to be increased to 1100, and that can have the effect of, well, the knock-on effect of that is, yes, a tenant can say, well, I don't really want to, but I will do. The tenant can say, okay, I'm going to leave. The net effect of that would be that the landlord can re-let it and get the rent up to the market rent.
Mm.
But the process for me would be trying to find common ground between both parties to keep tenant and landlord happy. Acknowledgement from a tenant that they are getting a good deal, not a ridiculously good deal, but a good deal, and an acknowledgement from a landlord why that rent is being paid. You've got three happy people.
So, have you ever had situations where tenants have challenged a rent increase? And if so, on what basis have they challenged it?
Well, the challenges is an exchange of emails, exchange of views. I can't afford to pay that now, but I would agree to you increasing it by £50 now, and then £50 in 12 months' time. And if they're long term, I wouldn't do that necessarily for short term tenants, but for long term tenants, they've been in the property for 9, 6, 7 years maybe. Then getting a resolution to that issue the best way possible is getting both parties to agree to a compromise.
Okay, so in terms of, I suppose, recapping this episode, let's look at what it really means. So Section 38, a Section 13 notice, rents can only be increased by serving a Section 13 notice. If you're a tenant who wants to challenge that, you can't challenge it because potentially you think it's unreasonable that the landlord is putting the rent up by £75 or £100 or even more than that. The challenge is the rent that I'm being charged, is the new rent I'm being charged an affordable rent and comparable with other rents in the local area? That's one of the fundamentals to come out of this. I think for landlords, are you charging a affordable rent? Are you charging a market rent? If you are, and you should be checking that, if you are, then that's all well and good. If you're not, then when you consider your Section 13 rent increase notice, you should be considering what the market rent is before you even start to put that rent increase on. Then I think you can do the variables, which are how long has the tenant been in? Do I want to keep it slightly below the affordable rent or the market rent for that property at the moment? Or do I want to charge the market rent? And there should be, I hope, some security that the tribunal will be able to determine what a market rent is. I think the other upshot is that we as letting agents, if we're serving Section 13 notices, need to be able to justify what the market rent is for that kind of property in the area.
Not difficult.
So again, I don't think Section 13 notices and the legislation around rent increases should cause landlords or tenants any concern. What it's doing is saying that rents should be market rents, not just, well, I fancy charging you this amount of money. It's got to be a market rent. And that's probably a good way of closing this particular episode. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the All Things Property Podcast. If you found this episode useful, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These things really help us reach the people who need to hear this advice. See you next week.